The vast marble hall of Hartwell Manor shimmered beneath the glittering light of dozens of crystal chandeliers, their soft illumination glinting gently off silk gowns and polished tuxedos. The wealthy elite of Manhattan mingled comfortably, toasting to a marriage that everyone knew was purely strategic. It was a union born from corporate necessity, lacking the warmth and affection usually associated with weddings. Standing rigidly at the far end of the room, Landon Hartwell observed the scene with quiet disdain. As the CEO of Hartwell Enterprises, he was no stranger to making cold, calculated decisions, yet nothing had prepared him for the discomfort of today. The bride, Bryony Eldridge, the woman he despised more than anyone, was now his wife. Their families had been corporate enemies for decades, their bitter rivalry spilling into every aspect of their intertwined lives. Marrying her had been the bitterest pill he had ever swallowed, yet necessary to secure control of his family's legacy according to the absurd conditions of his late father's will. Across the room, Bryony Eldridge was doing her best to maintain composure. Clad in an elegant ivory gown, she presented the perfect image of grace, even as her eyes betrayed quiet fury. She resented this marriage as deeply as Landon did. Raised as the heiress to Eldridge Industries, Bryony had grown up viewing the Hartwells as ruthless adversaries, responsible for decades of bitterness and betrayal between their families. Guests watched them carefully, whispering quietly about the obvious absence of affection between the bride and groom. Both Landon and Bryony were acutely aware that they were being scrutinized, yet neither cared to pretend otherwise. Each of them was fiercely proud, and neither would willingly show weakness before the other. As the reception continued, Landon reluctantly approached Bryony, offering her a stiff hand. "We should at least pretend to tolerate each other," he said quietly, bitterness edging every word. "For appearances, at least." Bryony lifted her gaze, her emerald eyes sparking with barely concealed anger. "I don't recall promising to pretend anything, Landon. We're married, but don't mistake that for surrender." Her voice was cool, polite enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention, yet sharp enough to make it clear that she had no intention of making this easy for him. Landon clenched his jaw tightly, meeting her defiant stare. Despite the tension crackling between them, he couldn't help noticing her beauty, the delicate curves of her face, the elegance of her posture, the stubborn defiance in her emerald eyes. But he quickly dismissed the thought, reminding himself that this woman represented everything he despised: entitlement, arrogance, the manipulation he associated with the Eldridge family. The evening stretched on painfully slow. Their first dance was stiff and awkward, each of them counting the seconds until they could finally escape the spotlight. As the guests began departing, murmuring polite congratulations, Landon and Bryony exchanged icy nods with those who approached them. Only when the last guest had gone did Landon exhale a deep, tense breath, realizing that the hardest part was yet to come, their wedding night. Hours later, the luxurious penthouse suite overlooking the New York skyline seemed suffocatingly silent. It had been prepared for their wedding night, complete with chilled champagne, white roses, and silk bedding, a lavish illusion of romance that both of them deeply resented. Landon loosened his bow tie in frustration as Bryony stood near the panoramic windows, arms wrapped protectively around herself, gazing out at the glittering city below. A tense silence lingered between them until finally, Landon broke it, his voice cold and weary. "We don't have to pretend any longer. I have no desire to share a room with you, Bryony. I'll sleep in the guest suite tonight." She turned slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and bitterness. "Fine by me. This marriage is a legal formality, the less we interact, the better." Yet, as he moved to leave, something stopped him at the door. A faint but unmistakable sadness in her voice gave him pause, stirring an unexpected pang of guilt. He turned back slowly, reluctantly studying her in the soft glow of the moonlight. For the first time, he noticed the vulnerability hidden beneath her proud exterior, a fragile beauty he had deliberately ignored. She looked delicate, standing alone in the grand room, lost in a reality neither of them had truly chosen. "Bryony," Landon began hesitantly, surprising even himself with the gentleness in his tone. "Look, I don't want to fight constantly. We're both trapped here, and perhaps if we tried to be civil. His voice faded, uncertain. She turned sharply toward him, eyes flashing with a mixture of pain and anger. Civil? Landon, our families despise each other. You despise me, I see it in your eyes every time you look at me. How do you suggest we pretend otherwise? He stepped closer, voice softening further despite his attempt to keep distance. I don't hate you personally, Bryony. I hate what you represent, decades of rivalry, pain inflicted by both our families. But I realize you never personally did anything to deserve my hostility. Her expression wavered slightly, the anger subsiding, replaced by something more vulnerable. I grew up hating your name. Every conflict in my life was tied somehow to your family. And now, being here with you, married to the enemy, feels like a betrayal of everything I've ever believed. Her voice trembled, the mask of strength slipping just enough to reveal the hurt beneath. Without thinking, Landon closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches away. The hostility that had previously filled the space between them was slowly replaced by a complex mix of curiosity, uncertainty, and an undeniable magnetism neither expected. I never wanted this either, Landon whispered, reaching out carefully, almost instinctively, to brush away a tear that had formed unnoticed on her cheek. But we have to live with it now. Perhaps we don't have to make it harder than it already is. Bryony froze at his gentle touch, her eyes searching his face for sincerity, wary of another betrayal yet somehow compelled by his unexpected tenderness. Can you really put aside the hatred that easily? She asked softly, vulnerability slipping unguarded into her voice. Landon hesitated, battling his pride and confusion before finally answering honestly. I don't know, Bryony. But right now, here, tonight, maybe we don't have to be enemies. Their eyes locked, hearts racing as the charged silence deepened, both sensing a shift neither could explain nor fully comprehend. Without fully understanding how or why, Landon closed the remaining distance between them. Gently, tentatively, he lowered his lips to hers, feeling her stiffen initially before she melted against him, her body responding with a warmth that surprised them both. In that quiet, surreal moment, their hostility dissolved into something new, fragile, tentative, yet profoundly powerful. Neither knew what the future would hold, but both felt deeply that this night had suddenly changed everything. The line between hatred and desire had blurred irrevocably, and as they stood entwined in the moonlit shadows, Landon began to realize something startling, something frighteningly unexpected. This woman, whom he had been so determined to despise, was already beginning to claim a place deep within his heart. The early morning sunlight streamed through the wide panoramic windows of their penthouse suite, casting gentle golden beams onto the plush carpet and silk sheets. Bryony opened her eyes slowly, her senses coming awake to the unfamiliar warmth beside her. She remained still for a moment, feeling the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man sleeping deeply beside her. Memories from last night flooded her consciousness, images vivid enough to make her heartbeat quicken and her cheeks flush in embarrassment and confusion. Carefully, she turned her head on the pillow to look at Landon. He was still asleep, his handsome features softened in repose, free of the constant tension that usually defined him. For the first time since they'd met, she allowed herself to truly study him. His dark hair was tousled, his brow smooth, and in sleep, he seemed gentle, approachable, even vulnerable. It was difficult to reconcile this peaceful man with the ruthless CEO she had so thoroughly despised only yesterday. A wave of complicated emotion flooded Bryony's chest. Their wedding had been a calculated merger, an act forced upon them by their family's rivalry and business necessity. But last night had shattered all pretenses, bringing something raw and unexpectedly intimate into their arrangement. Confusion and regret mingled with a strange tenderness inside her, and she quietly slipped out of bed, pulling on the silk robe that hung nearby, as if covering herself could also conceal her vulnerability. She moved toward the window, gazing out at the bustling streets far below. Manhattan was already awake, full of life and activity, but inside the penthouse, everything still felt suspended in surreal quietude. She wondered briefly how they would move forward from here. Would Landon revert to cold indifference, or had the night shifted something fundamental between them? The sound of rustling sheets behind her pulled Bryony from her thoughts, and she turned slowly to see Landon sitting up in bed. His gaze was fixed on her, expression unreadable at first, until he offered a hesitant, surprisingly genuine smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep, yet warmer than she'd ever heard it. "Good morning," she replied softly, her guard immediately rising again, unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar intimacy. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," Landon replied gently, stretching as he stood, grabbing a robe himself. He approached her carefully, sensing her hesitation, and stopped a comfortable distance away, respecting the uncertainty that hung between them. "How are you feeling?" Bryony considered the question for a moment, then gave an honest answer. Confused, she admitted, her gaze dropping briefly before returning to meet his eyes. "Last night was unexpected." Landon nodded slowly, the vulnerability in his expression mirroring her own. "I didn't plan for it either. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. And honestly, I don't regret it." Bryony studied him closely, looking for deception in his eyes but finding only sincerity. It shook her. "Landon, yesterday morning we hated each other. How do we go forward from here?" He took a slow breath, running a hand through his hair thoughtfully. "I don't know. But maybe we don't have to have all the answers right away. What if we simply agreed to give each other a chance? To put aside the animosity our families created and judge each other only by our own actions?" She hesitated, still guarding herself against the possibility of being hurt. "And if it doesn't work? What if this, whatever it is, falls apart?" Landon stepped closer, this time moving carefully until he stood directly in front of her. His gaze was sincere, almost pleading. "Then at least we tried. At least we faced the truth instead of hiding behind lies. Our families built their empires on bitterness, revenge, and suspicion. Maybe we can build something different." Bryony felt her resistance falter under the weight of his words. In the quiet vulnerability of that moment, standing together against the backdrop of the waking city, the idea of trying didn't seem as terrifying as she had imagined. She nodded slowly, allowing a tentative smile to soften her features. "All right," she finally said. "We'll try." In the hours that followed, the tentative truce they'd forged held steady, though fragile. They moved carefully around each other, their interactions polite but cautious, each word and gesture weighed for hidden meaning. Breakfast was shared quietly at a small table near the balcony, both of them painfully aware of the new, uncharted path before them. Yet, despite the awkwardness, something began subtly shifting between them. Landon listened attentively as Bryony talked softly about her life, her dreams, frustrations, even some of her fears. And as he shared small pieces of his own past, the rigid man she had once despised revealed unexpected depths, his childhood marked by a demanding father, his struggles to prove himself worthy of the family legacy. She listened intently, recognizing for the first time the heavy burdens Landon carried beneath his carefully constructed persona. By midday, Landon reluctantly excused himself to handle urgent matters at the office, leaving Bryony alone in the spacious suite. As soon as the door closed behind him, her phone vibrated, breaking the fragile spell of peace they'd created. The screen flashed with her father's name, Winston Eldridge. Hesitantly, she answered, her pulse quickening at the cold familiarity of his voice. "Bryony," he said without warmth. "Congratulations on becoming Mrs. Hartwell. I assume you understand your responsibilities." She tightened her grip on the phone, sensing the threat beneath his polite tone. "What do you mean?" "You're my daughter, and now you're perfectly positioned. I expect you to keep an eye on Landon. Report back anything useful. Remember your loyalty," Winston instructed, his voice sharp, authoritative. Her stomach churned with anxiety. "I'm not your spy," she answered defiantly, though her voice trembled slightly. "Landon and I might have differences, but I won't betray him." Winston's voice hardened, edged with cold displeasure. Don't let misguided loyalty cloud your judgment. Hartwell Enterprises destroyed our family's chance at dominance. Your marriage is strategic, don't disappoint me. He disconnected abruptly, leaving Bryony standing alone, shaken and conflicted. She'd hoped the worst was behind them, that perhaps their union could genuinely become something more. But her father's demands now complicated everything. Feeling trapped between loyalty to her family and a newfound, fragile trust developing with Landon, Bryony made a quiet promise to herself. She wouldn't allow her father's bitterness to poison the chance she had to build something genuine, something based on honesty, not deception. As evening fell, Landon returned. When he stepped into the room, Bryony met him with cautious openness, determined to be transparent. Landon, she began softly, gathering her courage. My father called. He expects me to spy on you. His expression hardened momentarily before he took a deep breath, visibly choosing to trust her. And what did you tell him? I refused, she replied without hesitation. I'm done playing those games. Landon approached her slowly, reaching out and gently taking her hands in his. The warmth of his touch surprised her, comforting in ways she'd never imagined possible. Thank you for telling me, he said, his voice sincere and gentle. Together we'll face this, whatever comes next. And in that quiet declaration of unity, Bryony felt the first real spark of hope. Their marriage had begun in bitterness, but the honesty of this moment hinted at something deeper, something neither had expected, yet both now desperately wanted. For the first time, the possibility of true partnership emerged clearly before them, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Bryony woke early, sunlight drifting softly through the gauzy curtains and gently illuminating the luxurious penthouse bedroom she now called home. She lay still for a moment, the previous night's events replaying vividly in her mind. Everything had changed so abruptly, so dramatically, that she found herself uncertain how to navigate the strange new reality that now defined her life. Her marriage to Landon had begun as an act of cold calculation, a contractual arrangement to satisfy family demands, but had quickly transformed into something more complicated, something infinitely more confusing. She glanced cautiously to her side, but the space next to her was empty. Landon had already risen, leaving only the faint warmth of his presence lingering on the sheets. Bryony felt a surprising twinge of disappointment mixed with relief. She was unsure if she could have faced him so soon after their unexpected intimacy. Slowly, she sat up, pulling the silk robe tightly around herself as she moved toward the adjoining bathroom, trying desperately to reconcile the feelings surging through her heart. Meanwhile, Landon stood quietly on the terrace, overlooking the bustling city below. The morning air was crisp, clearing his thoughts yet failing to resolve the chaos inside him. He felt torn between the ingrained resentment toward the Eldridge family and the startling tenderness Bryony had awakened within him. Last night had shattered all his carefully maintained defenses, forcing him to confront emotions he hadn't thought himself capable of experiencing. As he stood there, silently sipping his coffee, he resolved to regain control. Landon Hartwell was not a man accustomed to weakness, and he refused to allow one night of vulnerability to undermine his carefully constructed world. Yet the memory of Bryony's gentle gaze, the warmth of her touch, lingered stubbornly, complicating everything. When Bryony finally emerged from the bedroom, she found him standing in the dining area, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit, ready to face the corporate battlefield awaiting him. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of uncertainty passing between them. Landon cleared his throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Good morning, he said politely, his voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the passion they'd shared mere hours before. There's breakfast if you're hungry. I'll be at the office all day. Bryony hesitated, sensing the emotional wall he'd quickly rebuilt around himself. She nodded slowly, accepting the distance he clearly wanted to re-establish. Of course, she replied quietly, masking her hurt behind cool indifference. I'll find something to occupy myself. As he moved toward the door, Landon paused, turning back briefly. His expression softened for just a moment, betraying an internal struggle. "Bryony," he said carefully, choosing each word with caution, "last night wasn't planned, but I don't regret it." She met his gaze, feeling a glimmer of hope amid her confusion. "Neither do I," she admitted softly, yet her tone retained a guarded edge. "But I understand if you need distance." He hesitated, clearly conflicted, before nodding slowly. "We'll talk tonight," he finally said, stepping out of the suite before she could reply. Left alone, Bryony sank onto the nearby sofa, confusion swirling in her mind. Landon's behavior left her bewildered, unsure whether to trust the vulnerability she'd glimpsed in him or retreat behind her defenses once again. The line between enemy and lover had blurred dramatically, and she found herself navigating uncharted emotional territory. To distract herself, Bryony spent the morning exploring the spacious penthouse, familiarizing herself with the luxurious but sterile environment. Eventually, she found her way into Landon's private study, a room filled with polished wooden shelves lined meticulously with volumes on economics, leadership, and strategic management. His desk, immaculate and imposing, reflected his disciplined nature. Drawn by curiosity, she approached the desk, her eyes landing upon a framed photograph resting discreetly near the edge. She picked it up carefully, surprised by what she saw. It was an old, faded photograph showing Landon as a young boy, standing beside his father. In stark contrast to the powerful figure she'd known from bitter tales, the elder Hartwell looked warm, his arm draped protectively around a much younger, smiling Landon. A pang of sympathy struck her heart. Perhaps Landon had once been as innocent and hopeful as she had been, both their lives shaped mercilessly by the conflict between their families. She gently replaced the photograph, startled by the realization that beneath his hard exterior, Landon carried wounds as deep as her own. Later that afternoon, seeking distraction, Bryony went out to walk through Central Park, savoring the anonymity the city provided. Yet, despite the bustle around her, her mind constantly returned to Landon, the contradictions, the emotional turmoil, the unexpected longing that stirred within her each time she thought of him. By evening, the anxiety in her chest intensified. Returning to the penthouse, she found Landon already waiting for her in the living area, nursing a glass of whiskey. He appeared lost in thought, eyes fixed on the skyline beyond the window. When he sensed her arrival, he turned slowly, his gaze unreadable. "Did you enjoy your day?" "Not particularly," she admitted quietly, meeting his intense stare directly. "I spent most of it thinking." Landon sighed softly, gesturing toward a chair across from him. "So did I. Perhaps we should be honest with each other." Bryony settled onto the edge of a plush armchair, her heart thudding anxiously. "I'm listening." He hesitated, carefully considering his words. "Last night forced me to confront things I've spent years avoiding. My entire life, I've despised your family, holding you accountable for the sins of our parents. But after what happened, after the way you opened up to me, I can't simply ignore how much I misjudged you." She studied him warily. "So, what does that mean for us?" "I don't know," he admitted softly. "But I'm willing to find out. If you're willing to try." Bryony held his gaze, feeling the weight of vulnerability behind his words. "I never asked to be your enemy, Landon," she whispered, stepping closer. "But neither did I ask to feel, whatever it is I feel for you now." He reached out cautiously, taking her hand in his, the warmth of his fingers sending a thrill through her heart. "We've inherited this feud," he said solemnly, "but perhaps it's our choice now to end it." Bryony's eyes searched his face, the sincerity she found there easing her doubts. "Can we really trust each other?" Landon drew her closer, his voice soft but resolute. "Maybe not yet, completely, but perhaps we can start by simply being honest." They stood together silently, absorbing the significance of the moment. Finally, she spoke gently. "Then here's my honesty, I'm scared to trust you, Landon, but part of me desperately wants to." He nodded slowly, understanding shining in his eyes. I feel the same, he murmured, his voice heavy with sincerity. But maybe that fear is the first step towards something real. In that quiet confession, something within them shifted. A fragile understanding emerged, connecting them in a way neither had anticipated. And as the evening deepened into night, Bryony allowed herself the smallest glimpse of hope, that perhaps their union, born from hatred and manipulation, could become something more powerful, meaningful, and lasting than either of them had ever imagined possible. Bryony sat silently in the expansive study of the Hartwell family mansion, the soft ticking of an antique clock punctuating the quiet atmosphere as she thumbed slowly through the pages of an old leather-bound journal she'd discovered, hidden deep in the archives of Landon's private library. She hadn't been deliberately snooping, curiosity had simply overtaken her as she'd explored the vast manor, trying to understand the man she now shared her life with. Her eyes widened slightly as she scanned the faded pages, heart thudding heavily in her chest. The elegant handwriting belonged unmistakably to Landon's late father, Charles Hartwell. But the content of the journal entries shattered every belief she'd ever held about the feud between their families. The pages revealed a story she'd never heard, of a young Alexander Hartwell, Landon's father, and a woman he deeply loved, Clarissa Eldridge, Bryony's own mother. Bryony's breath caught painfully in her throat as she turned page after page, uncovering the heartbreaking truth of a romance that had blossomed decades earlier, in secret, hidden from the ruthless ambitions of their families. Letters tucked between journal pages revealed tender words, desperate plans for escape, and devastating pleas for understanding and forgiveness. The young lovers had dreamed of a life together, away from the bitter rivalries and harsh expectations imposed upon them. A sudden, bitter realization dawned upon Bryony: she and Landon were not merely victims of corporate manipulations, but of a legacy rooted in pain, secrecy, and heartbreak. Her pulse quickened with a mixture of anger and sadness. How different their lives might have been had love triumphed over familial hatred. Before she could fully process her discoveries, the heavy door behind her swung open abruptly, causing her to jump in startled alarm. Landon stood there, watching her with narrowed eyes, his gaze immediately falling on the open journal in her trembling hands. A flash of defensiveness flickered across his expression. "What are you doing in here, Bryony?" he demanded quietly, though without the sharpness she'd once expected from him. I didn't mean to pry," she stammered, feeling suddenly guilty despite her innocence. "I found this while exploring." "Landon, did you know about your father and my mother?" He closed the door softly behind him, stepping toward her cautiously, his eyes drifting briefly toward the pages she held. "Only vaguely," he admitted reluctantly. "My father hinted once that he'd known Clarissa Eldridge, but I never imagined it was anything deeper than a passing acquaintance." Bryony carefully handed him the journal, watching as he glanced down at the pages. His expression shifted slowly from guarded confusion to a deep, quiet sorrow. "I had no idea," he murmured softly, his voice laced with regret. "They loved each other. And it seems their families destroyed them." She nodded slowly, her voice quiet yet firm. "This feud has taken so much from both our families. How many lives were ruined by grudges that weren't even ours to begin with?" Landon gently closed the journal, looking up to meet her gaze, his eyes heavy with newfound understanding. "I always blamed your family for everything, for my father's bitterness, my mother's loneliness, my own unhappiness. But it appears we've both been misled. Neither side is innocent." Bryony reached out carefully, laying her hand lightly upon his arm. "We can't change the past, Landon, but maybe we can stop it from defining our future. Perhaps their tragedy can teach us something about forgiveness, something about choosing differently." He studied her carefully, his voice hesitant but sincere. "I don't know if forgiveness is something I know how to give easily. But for the first time, I want to try. Because of you." Bryony felt a warmth bloom inside her chest at his words. For a brief moment, standing together in the quiet intimacy of that room filled with faded memories and painful truths, she saw clearly the man Landon truly was beneath his hardened exterior, a man shaped by disappointment and loss, yet desperately longing for connection. "You know, for years I thought your family were monsters," she whispered. "But now, seeing this, knowing what our parents suffered, I see how blind I've been. I've held on to hatred, without ever realizing how it was poisoning me, too." Landon placed the journal gently onto a nearby table and stepped closer, reaching out to gently brush his fingers across her cheek. "We were both blind, Bryony. But maybe, just maybe, fate gave us this chance to finally see clearly." They stood quietly together, absorbing the weight of this revelation. Finally, Bryony broke the silence, softly and hesitantly. "What if we don't repeat their mistakes? What if, instead of holding on to old bitterness, we truly gave ourselves permission to start fresh? To trust, despite everything that's happened between our families?" Landon's gaze softened, a vulnerability surfacing that touched her deeply. "I've never wanted to trust someone more in my life," he admitted quietly. "It terrifies me, Bryony, because it means letting go of everything I've known. But I think I want to trust you, even if that means risking being hurt." Her heart swelled painfully at the honesty in his voice, and she found herself stepping closer, bridging the distance that had so long divided them. "I'm scared too," she whispered, "but maybe our fear is proof that this matters, that what we're building together is worth fighting for." In the hush that followed, Landon drew her gently into his embrace, holding her with a tenderness that was both comforting and exhilarating. Bryony rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart, allowing herself, for the first time, to truly believe in the possibility of happiness. Around them, the quiet study seemed to shift subtly, transforming from a room filled with sorrowful echoes of the past into a space where hope had found its first foothold. Together, they stood at the crossroads of legacy and choice, determined not to repeat the tragic mistakes of their parents. Instead, they would forge a new path, one built not on bitterness and rivalry, but upon understanding, compassion, and the fragile yet powerful promise of newfound love, the soft, amber glow of twilight-bathed Hartwell Manor in a comforting embrace, giving the ancient stone walls and manicured gardens a tranquil beauty that seemed at odds with the emotional storm brewing within. Landon stood silently at the window of the study, his face illuminated by the fading sunlight as he contemplated the dramatic revelations that had unfolded between him and Bryony just days earlier. Since discovering their parents' tragic history, the atmosphere between them had changed dramatically. Gone were the hostile silences and guarded glares, replaced by moments of vulnerability, cautious affection, and hesitant hope. Yet, despite this newfound tenderness, Landon still felt uneasy, haunted by the fear that this fragile truce might shatter at any moment. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a sharp knock on the heavy oak door. Before Landon could answer, the door swung open, revealing his younger brother, Callan Hartwell. Callan stepped into the room confidently, a casual smirk on his handsome face, eyes sharp with hidden calculation. "Landon," Callan began smoothly, closing the door behind him and approaching with slow, deliberate steps. "I've heard whispers around the office, things about you and Bryony. I'm concerned about what this means for the future of our company." Landon's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He'd always known Callan harbored deep resentment, never fully accepting Landon's role as the head of Hartwell Enterprises. Yet, despite their strained relationship, Landon had hoped his brother would rise above petty jealousy. "Bryony and I are doing just fine," Landon answered evenly, masking the rising irritation in his voice. "Our personal lives shouldn't concern you." Callan's eyes narrowed slightly, an almost imperceptible tension flickering through his posture. "On the contrary, your marriage affects everything, the company, our reputation, the legacy our father built. Have you forgotten who she is? An Eldridge. The daughter of our father's greatest enemy. How can you trust her?" Landon met his brother's probing stare calmly, though internally he felt a surge of protectiveness. "I trust her because I've gotten to know her," he replied firmly. "The Eldridge-Hartwell feud is a burden neither of us asked for, and we refuse to let it define our relationship or our lives." Callan shook his head slowly, feigning disappointment. You're being naive, Landon. Love, or whatever it is you think you feel, can blind even the sharpest minds. Be careful. The Eldridges have always played dirty. Landon stepped closer, his voice dropping into a firm, icy tone. I'll handle my marriage, Callan. And I won't allow you or anyone else to interfere. Callan raised his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes gleamed with suppressed anger. Suit yourself. But remember my warning when this blows up in your face. He turned abruptly, leaving the room and shutting the door firmly behind him. Landon exhaled slowly, troubled by Callan's hostility but determined not to let his brother's bitterness sabotage the tentative happiness he had found with Bryony. Meanwhile, in another wing of the mansion, Bryony sat quietly at an ornate dressing table in her bedroom, reflecting on everything she and Landon had uncovered. She was startled from her thoughts by the vibration of her phone. Her heart sank when she saw her father's name flash insistently across the screen. With dread pooling in her stomach, she answered reluctantly. Father. Winston Eldridge's voice was cold and commanding, devoid of any warmth. Bryony, we need to speak. Immediately. She stiffened. About what? His voice hardened further. Your marriage is becoming problematic. Sources indicate you're becoming emotionally involved with Landon Hartwell. I warned you, your only purpose in that household is to gain intelligence and weaken our enemy, not to fall under his influence. Anger surged through Bryony, mingled with hurt. I married Landon because you forced me into it, she snapped back sharply. But I'm not your spy, and I refuse to play your twisted games. Winston paused, a menacing edge creeping into his tone. You're my daughter, Bryony. Don't forget your loyalty to your family. The Hartwells have done irreparable damage to us. They deserve whatever misery comes their way. Tears of frustration burned behind her eyes, yet she forced her voice to remain steady. Your feud cost my mother her happiness, her chance at love. I won't let it take mine. A long, tense silence stretched before Winston finally responded, his voice low and dangerously calm. Then you're making a grave mistake. I hope you're prepared to accept the consequences. He disconnected abruptly, leaving Bryony shaken, her pulse racing. She knew her father well enough to understand that he would stop at nothing to destroy any chance she and Landon had at happiness. The tension lingered through the evening. As darkness enveloped the mansion, Landon sought Bryony out, finding her alone on the balcony, staring blankly at the distant city lights. He approached quietly, sensing her distress. Bryony, he began softly, gently placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. What happened? She hesitated, then turned to face him, vulnerability raw in her emerald eyes. My father called. He knows we're growing closer, and he's furious. He threatened us, threatened you, Landon. Landon's expression hardened instantly, protective instincts surging forward. I won't let him hurt you, or us. Whatever he's planning, we'll face it together. She shook her head, despair filling her voice. I don't want you hurt because of me. Our families have hurt each other enough already. Tenderly, Landon cupped her face, forcing her gaze to meet his. Listen to me carefully, Bryony. Whatever the Eldridges or even my brother Callan might try, nothing will change how I feel about you. I've made my choice, I'm choosing us. Her eyes filled with tears, emotions overwhelming her. Are we strong enough to face this? Yes, Landon replied firmly, his voice resolute. Because this time, we won't let anyone tear us apart. In that quiet moment, standing close beneath the soft glow of moonlight, Bryony felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude and love. She leaned into Landon's embrace, allowing herself to fully believe, for the first time, that perhaps they could build a future free from the toxic legacy of hatred. Though uncertainties loomed, their determination to overcome their family's feud burned brightly between them. Love had become their greatest weapon against betrayal, bitterness, and resentment. And as Landon held her gently, Bryony knew with absolute certainty that their hearts were finally united in a way that neither family nor fate could ever again divide. Early the next morning, the sky was overcast, clouds hanging low and gray, mirroring the mood inside Hartwell Manor. The revelations from the night before still lingered heavily in the air, weighing down every conversation, every silence. Bryony had barely slept, haunted by her father's threats and the unsettling knowledge that their fragile truce was about to face its most severe test yet. She dressed slowly, selecting a simple, elegant black dress that felt more like armor than clothing. Today, she and Landon planned to confront Winston Eldridge directly. They'd decided there was no other way, either they faced him head-on, or they'd forever remain vulnerable to his manipulations. Bryony's pulse quickened at the thought. Her father had always intimidated her, his presence authoritative, his demands absolute. Yet the anger she now felt toward him fueled her resolve. Landon was already waiting in the foyer when she descended the grand staircase. He stood tall and composed, impeccably dressed as always, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Despite his outward confidence, she knew this confrontation was equally daunting for him. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, reaching out and gently taking her hand as she approached. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, gripping his hand tightly, finding strength in the warmth of his touch. They drove in silence to the Eldridge family estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of the city that had always felt cold and imposing to Bryony. Today, it seemed even more forbidding, looming ominously beneath a sky heavy with impending rain. Inside the grand drawing room, Winston Eldridge stood waiting for them, his posture rigid, his face coldly indifferent. His steely eyes tracked their every step as they entered. He made no effort to welcome them, merely nodding curtly as they stopped a few feet away. "So, you've decided to confront me openly," Winston began, his voice cool and controlled. "I assume this means you've made your choice, Bryony. You've chosen him over your family." Bryony stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly but steady with determination. "You've never given me much choice, Father. But I'm choosing now, choosing to break free from the cycle of bitterness you've trapped us all in." Winston raised an eyebrow mockingly, clearly unimpressed. "And you, Landon? You believe my daughter is worth risking everything your family built?" Landon's expression remained firm, unwavering. "Bryony isn't the enemy. She's not the one threatening our family's legacies. You are. The feud you've clung to has poisoned generations. It ends now." Winston chuckled coldly, unbothered by Landon's words. "You two think you're the heroes in this little story, don't you? Defying family tradition, overcoming hatred with love. Romantic nonsense. Do you even realize what I've done to ensure Eldridge dominance? You both underestimate me greatly." Bryony felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "What do you mean?" Her father turned slowly, eyes filled with a cruel satisfaction. "Ask your husband about the company accounts, the recent leaks, missing information, strategic failures. Ask Landon how his trusted brother, Callan, has been quietly sabotaging Hartwell Enterprises, under my guidance." Landon froze, eyes widening slightly in shock before narrowing in anger. "You're lying," he accused sharply. "Callan would never betray our family." Winston smiled bitterly, stepping closer with an air of superiority. "Your brother resents you deeply. It wasn't difficult to convince him that partnering with me would finally allow him to take what he believes is rightfully his. Family loyalty, it seems, is weaker than ambition." Landon clenched his fists tightly at his sides, fury blazing in his eyes. "You manipulated him." "I merely guided him," Winston corrected coldly, smugly reveling in his revelation. "Your brother made his choice willingly. The Hartwell empire is already crumbling from within." Bryony turned sharply to Landon, her heart breaking at the raw betrayal etched on his face. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm, desperate to ease the pain radiating from him. "Landon, I'm so sorry." He took a steadying breath, forcing himself to remain composed, though his voice shook with suppressed anger. We'll deal with Callan later. Right now, Winston, this ends. Your games, your schemes, your destructive obsession with revenge, it's all over. Winston's eyes flashed with fury, momentarily losing his careful control. You're both naive fools. Do you honestly think your petty declarations will end decades of animosity? The Hartwells and Eldridges will never have peace. Bryony straightened, stepping firmly toward her father, refusing to show fear. Only because you won't allow it. I've spent my entire life trapped between your hatred and bitterness. But no more. You destroyed my mother's chance at happiness, you won't do the same to me. Winston's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, a brief flicker of genuine emotion surfacing before he quickly masked it. Your mother was weak. She chose sentimental nonsense over family duty. Bryony felt a surge of raw anger, fueled by years of pain and loss. My mother loved deeply, something you've never understood. Landon and I refuse to let your obsession ruin our lives like it did hers. Landon stepped forward protectively, his voice calm yet steely with resolve. We won't continue this feud. We're ending it here and now, Winston. Callan will be dealt with, and your attempts to sabotage us will fail. Winston stood silently for a long moment, his glare sharp and defiant. Finally, he gave a humorless laugh, stepping away from them dismissively. You think you've won, but you'll soon learn the cost of your arrogance. Bryony reached out, gripping Landon's hand tightly, feeling the tension radiating from his body. Let's go, she whispered softly, sensing they'd accomplished all they could today. As they left the estate and climbed back into the car, heavy rain began falling, drenching the world around them. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was tense, thick with silence and unspoken emotions. Finally, Landon broke the quiet, his voice heavy with regret and sadness. I can't believe Callan betrayed me, he admitted softly. I trusted him completely. Bryony squeezed his hand gently, offering comfort. We'll find out the whole truth, Landon. And we'll get through this, together. He glanced toward her, gratitude flickering in his eyes despite the pain. I don't deserve your loyalty. She shook her head slowly, meeting his gaze firmly. You have it anyway. You've earned it by fighting for us. The drive home was quiet, each absorbed in their own thoughts, understanding the battle was far from over. Yet despite the uncertainty and betrayal they'd faced, the bond between them had only strengthened. Bryony knew with absolute certainty now, they were no longer defined by their family's legacy of hatred. They'd chosen a different path, one of trust, honesty, and determination to build a future free from the destructive mistakes of their past. Later that week, the storm of confrontation had barely subsided when Landon and Bryony found themselves huddled together in the quiet solitude of Landon's private office, a room rarely visited by anyone outside the inner circle of Hartwell Enterprises. The heavy, polished oak desk, littered with financial reports and confidential memos, now served as the backdrop for a new kind of battle, one waged not in boardrooms or corporate intrigues, but in whispered plans and determined glances between two souls fighting to reclaim their destiny. Landon paced slowly near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, his dark eyes distant with thought as he wrestled with the recent betrayal. Callan's actions had cut deeper than any corporate setback, striking at the very core of his identity and shattering the fragile trust he'd begun to rebuild with Bryony. Every step he took echoed the memories of promises once made in confidence, now betrayed by a brother whose ambition had overtaken loyalty. The weight of the revelations pressed down on him, and as he stopped near the window, he exhaled slowly as if trying to release the toxic mixture of anger and sorrow that had built up within. Bryony entered the room silently, her presence as steady as the calm before a storm. She approached Landon, noticing the slight furrow in his brow, the way his shoulders were tensed as if bracing for an inevitable confrontation. Landon, she began, her voice low and earnest, we can't let this continue unchecked. We have to find out exactly what Callan's been doing. Not just for our sake, but for the future of both our families. Her eyes, normally so guarded and cool, shone with an inner fire that spoke of determination. We must reclaim our story before the sins of the past, and the ambitions of those who thrive on betrayal, destroy what little hope remains. Landon turned to face her, the conflict evident in his gaze, an internal struggle between the familiar urge to retreat into solitude and the unexpected strength he'd found in her unwavering support. "I know," he murmured. "Every time I look at the financial discrepancies, every time I hear whispers of secret meetings, I see the fingerprints of Callan's treachery. I thought I could trust him, but now," his voice faltered momentarily, laden with the bitterness of shattered brotherhood. Bryony stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "We will uncover the truth. We need to gather evidence, every document, every email, every conversation that points to his collusion with your father, or even with my father's ambitions. We need to expose the chain of lies that has allowed this feud to fester and, in doing so, dismantle the very foundation upon which our family's hatred is built." Her tone was resolute, yet there was a tenderness in it that reminded him of why he had begun to see her not as an enemy, but as an equal partner in this strange, painful journey toward redemption. Together, they spent the afternoon poring over financial records and confidential correspondence in Landon's office. The room, once merely a symbol of corporate power, had transformed into a sanctum of truth, where whispered confessions and shared glances bridged the gap between two wounded hearts. Every document they uncovered, the subtle misappropriations, the offhand memos, the coded messages hidden in routine transactions, was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that revealed a network of deception carefully constructed to benefit those who would stop at nothing to maintain their power. As the afternoon light waned, Landon discovered an encrypted file buried within a series of innocuous-looking emails. With Bryony's help, he painstakingly decoded it, revealing a damning account of clandestine meetings between Callan and a mysterious intermediary. The file detailed plans to divert funds, to weaken Hartwell Enterprises from the inside, and even mentioned names that implicated higher-ups in both families. Every word was a dagger to Landon's heart, but it also galvanized him. "This is it," he whispered, almost reverently, as he looked over the evidence with trembling hands. "This proves that the hatred isn't as clear-cut as we believed. It's been manipulated, fueled by ambition and betrayal." Bryony nodded, her mind racing with the implications. "It means we have a chance to end this destructive cycle, if we expose it all. Not just for us, but for every employee, every family member, and every person caught in the crossfire of this bitter war." Her voice was firm, carrying the promise of change, a promise that had begun to take root in the depths of both their hearts. That night, as rain battered the windows and the city outside pulsed with the relentless energy of a restless metropolis, Landon and Bryony convened a private meeting with a small, trusted team within the Hartwell board. In a dimly lit conference room, laden with the weight of impending decisions, they presented the evidence they had gathered. Their voices, once cold and calculated, now carried a warmth and determination that resonated with every listener. The team, initially skeptical, gradually began to see the truth in the carefully laid out documents, the betrayal that had infiltrated their ranks, and the potential for a new beginning if they could expel the corruption that had taken root. In that moment, a silent accord was reached. The evidence would be used not as a weapon to settle old scores, but as a catalyst for reform. The goal was clear: to dismantle the toxic legacy of enmity and greed and to build a foundation of trust, transparency, and shared responsibility. Landon and Bryony, standing side by side, felt an unspoken solidarity that transcended their troubled past. They were not merely fighting against an external enemy, they were battling the internal demons that had long defined their families' histories. As the meeting adjourned and the team dispersed into the night, Landon and Bryony lingered in the empty room, the weight of their decisions mingling with a sense of cautious hope. Landon took Bryony's hand, his grip firm and resolute. "This is only the beginning," he said quietly. "But I believe that together, we can turn this feud into something positive, a legacy of change." Bryony met his gaze with a small, determined smile. "I've always believed that love and truth can overcome even the darkest shadows of the past," she replied softly. Let's make sure that our future is defined by forgiveness and progress, not by endless vengeance. In that intimate moment, beneath the hum of the city and the patter of relentless rain, they vowed to fight for a better tomorrow, a tomorrow where the sins of the past would no longer dictate the course of their lives, and where the love they had unearthed amid betrayal and loss would serve as the beacon guiding them toward redemption and reconciliation. As dusk settled over Manhattan, the final chapter of their tumultuous journey unfolded in a grand, candlelit ballroom within Hartwell Manor. The room, transformed for an evening of celebration rather than confrontation, now pulsed with hope and anticipation. Soft music played in the background, a gentle piano melody that mingled with hushed voices of newfound allies and reconciliations. Landon and Bryony stood at the center, their faces radiant not with the pride of victory over enemies, but with the quiet satisfaction of having turned a bitter legacy into a promise of renewal. The evening was not merely a celebration of a corporate restructuring or the public unveiling of a series of reforms. It was a tribute to every soul who had suffered under the weight of the old feud, a public declaration that the time for endless vengeance had passed. In the months leading up to this night, Landon and Bryony had worked tirelessly. Together with a small but determined team, they had reformed Hartwell Enterprises, purging corrupt influences and initiating sweeping measures for transparency and ethical leadership. They had forged unexpected alliances with community leaders and even reached out to estranged members of the Eldridge family who, like them, yearned for peace. At the head of the ballroom, a large screen displayed images and testimonials from those whose lives had been changed by the new initiatives, environmental cleanup projects, scholarship programs, and community outreach efforts that promised to heal the scars of decades of corporate neglect. The atmosphere was charged with a collective resolve to build a future free from the bitterness of the past. Landon, dressed in a tailored suit that now seemed to embody both authority and warmth, stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. His voice, steady and sincere, filled the room. Today, we are not here to dwell on the sins of our ancestors, nor to continue the cycle of hatred that has defined our families for far too long. We stand at a crossroads, where our choices can forge a new legacy, one built on transparency, integrity, and compassion. His gaze swept over the audience, lingering on familiar faces from both sides of the divide, and on Bryony, whose resolute eyes mirrored his own determination. Bryony took her place beside him, her voice soft yet firm as she continued, "For many years, I believed that I was destined to be a pawn in a game of corporate warfare and bitter revenge. But tonight, I see a different future, a future where we, together, choose forgiveness over grudges, unity over division. I believe that love, when nurtured with honesty and courage, can transform even the darkest legacies." The applause that followed was not raucous, but measured and heartfelt, a collective acceptance of the new path that had been chosen. After the speeches, the celebration turned into a lively dinner, where old rivals and estranged family members found themselves sharing stories and laughter that had long been suppressed by bitterness. In quiet corners of the ballroom, Landon and Bryony moved together like a single entity, sometimes sharing whispered plans for the future, at other times simply savoring the gentle warmth of their hands entwined. Their eyes met frequently, each glance reaffirming the unspoken promise they had made to one another, that love and truth would always be their guiding lights. Outside, the manor's gardens had been set alight with soft, glowing lanterns, leading a winding path to a secluded terrace. There, under the star-studded sky, Landon and Bryony stole a few moments for themselves away from the crowd. They walked slowly along the garden path, the cool night air carrying the subtle fragrance of blooming roses, a stark contrast to the acrid memories of past conflicts. Landon stopped by a small fountain, water trickling gently over intricately carved stone, and turned to Bryony with an intensity that belied the calm of the night. "I remember the moment when I first felt something stir in my heart, a moment I never thought possible when I looked at you with hatred and disdain. That night changed everything. And now, I stand before you, not as the man I was forced to be, but as someone who has learned to love despite all odds." His voice trembled slightly with raw emotion, the vulnerability he had once guarded so jealously now laid bare in the moonlight. Bryony's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she reached for his hand. I too have seen the transformation. I have realized that we are not defined by the legacies of our families, but by the choices we make every day. I choose to trust you, Landon, and to build something beautiful from the ruins of our past. In that tender moment, all the pain, betrayal, and bitterness of the years before seemed to dissolve into the soft night air. Their shared resolve, fortified by truth and mutual understanding, was a beacon for all who witnessed it. The couple had not only united their personal lives but had also set in motion a movement that promised to heal old wounds and open the door to lasting reconciliation between the Hartwells and Eldridges. As the evening drew to a close, the crowd slowly dispersed into the cool night, leaving behind an echo of hope and the promise of a new dawn. Landon and Bryony remained on the terrace for a long while, their silhouettes framed by the gentle glow of lanterns and the vast, starry sky. They spoke quietly of plans yet to be made, dreams they wished to pursue, and the challenges they knew lay ahead. Yet, amid the uncertainty of the future, one truth was undeniable: the love they had kindled in the fires of strife was real, resilient, and had the power to transform not only their lives but also the fate of their families. In the quiet hush that followed, as the first hints of dawn began to tint the horizon with pale light, they stood together, two souls united by choice rather than destiny, ready to face a future defined by hope, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of love.